Lesser Hippias by Plato. Translated by Benjamin Jowett. Modern English translation ChatGPT 3.5. Editor, Sir Adam S. Barnett. Introduction. Now, let's turn our attention to the Lesser Hippias. This dialogue can be compared to Plato's earlier dialogues, where the contrast between Socrates and the sophist is most pronounced. Hippias, like Protagoras and Gorgias, is civil but vain and boastful. He claims to know everything and can make anything, including his own clothes. He is a poet, a speaker, and a craftsman who can create seal rings, shoes, and strigils. He even weaves his own girdle of exceptional quality. He is more vain and frivolous than the two great sophists, but he shares their character and is equally resistant to Socrates' direct method of questioning. Eventually, Hippias grows tired of being defeated by Socrates at every turn and is reluctant to continue the discussion, much like Thrasymachus, Protagoras, Callicles, and others who also show this reluctance. Hippias, like Protagoras, has common sense on his side when he argues that Homer intended Achilles to be the bravest and Odysseus the wisest of the Greeks, citing passages from the Iliad as evidence. However, he is easily refuted by Socrates' superior dialectics. Socrates pretends to show that Achilles is not true to his word and that Odysseus does not display a similar inconsistency. Hippias argues that Achilles unintentionally speaks falsely, while Odysseus does so intentionally. Socrates then poses the question of whether it is better to do wrong intentionally or unintentionally. Socrates, drawing on the analogy of the arts, argues for the former, while Hippias argues for the latter. All of this is in line with Plato's style, where Socrates doesn't always argue on the side of truth. The excessive reasoning about Homer, which is satirical, is also characteristic of Plato. Poetry turned into logic is even more absurd than rhetoric turned into logic and equally fallacious. Throughout history, there have been thinkers who could never grasp the true essence of Homer or any other book they read. Socrates' argument, where he highlights the apparent inconsistencies and contradictions in Achilles' words and actions and concludes that he who is true is also false, reminds us of Socrates' interpretation of Simonides in the Protagoras and similar reasoning in the first book of the Republic. The discrepancies that Socrates points out in Achilles' words are perhaps as significant as those identified by some modern scholars who argue for the separation of the Homeric poems. In the end, Socrates, having trapped Hippias in the discussion of voluntary and involuntary actions, is forced to admit that he himself is wandering in the same maze. He reflects on himself in the same way others would reflect on him. He is not surprised that he is facing difficulties, but he is surprised by Hippias. He becomes aware of the seriousness of the situation when ordinary people like himself can no longer seek wisdom from the wise. It is worth noting, in relation to the authenticity of this dialogue, that 1. The manners of the speakers are less subtle and refined compared to other dialogues by Plato. 2. Socrates' sophistry is more obvious and shameless, and also more meaningless. And 3. There are many similarities in thought and style with other dialogues. Whether these resemblances support or challenge the authenticity of an ancient writing is an important question that must be answered on a case-by-case basis. It is true that a writer may repeat himself just as a forger may imitate. Plato, in his writings, is known for his repetitions, whether intentional or due to forgetfulness. The parallelisms in the Lesser Hippias do not necessarily imply that the dialogue is the work of a forger. However, the parallelisms in the Greater Hippias, along with the allusion to the Lesser Hippias, raise suspicion. These parallelisms are of poor quality and unlikely to have been written by Plato himself. The Greater Hippias is more similar to the Euthydemus, but it is far inferior in quality. The Lesser Hippias, on the other hand, seems to have more merit and embodies the spirit of Plato. Both dialogues mention Hippias' art of memory. Hippias is portrayed as a vain and boastful character in both dialogues, but his arrogance is even more exaggerated in the Greater Hippias. He is a lesser version of Hippodamus of Miletus, as mentioned in Aristotle's Politics. The Lesser Hippias can be compared favorably to other genuine dialogues of Plato, such as the Republic and the Laches, in terms of Socrates' cunning in argument and his feelings about arguments. Although the Lesser Hippias is not as good as Plato's other works, it is reasonable to believe that it was written by him due to its considerable excellence and the consistent tradition dating back to Aristotle and his school. The fact that the dialogue falls below Plato's usual standard, or that he attributes an unmeaning paradox to Socrates, is not enough reason to doubt its authenticity. In this dialogue, the characters are Eutychus, Socrates, and Hippias. Eutychus asks Socrates why he is silent after Hippias' impressive display and encourages him to either refute Hippias' words or join in praising him. Socrates expresses his desire to ask Hippias about his views on Homer. He mentions that Eutychus' father, Apomantus, believes that the Iliad is a superior poem to the Odyssey because Achilles is a better man than Odysseus. Socrates wants to know Hippias' opinion on these two heroes and which one he considers to be better. Eutychus assures Socrates that Hippias will be happy to answer his questions. Socrates then remarks on Hippias' confidence in his own wisdom, comparing it to a muscular hero's fearlessness in combat. Hippias claims that he has never found anyone superior to him since he first competed at Olympia. Socrates sarcastically praises Hippias' wisdom and its value to the city of Elis and his parents. He then asks Hippias to clarify his views on Odysseus and Achilles, as he did not fully understand during Hippias' exhibition. Hippias explains that Homer intended Achilles to be the bravest, Nestor the wisest, and Odysseus the most cunning. Socrates admits that he had difficulty understanding Hippias' statement about Odysseus.
Will you tell me, and then I will perhaps understand you better? Hasn't Homer portrayed Achilles as cunning?
Certainly not, Socrates. He is the most straightforward of men, and when Homer has them conversing with each other in the passage called the Prayers, Achilles is supposed to say to Odysseus, son of Laertes, descended from heaven, clever Odysseus, I will speak plainly the word that I intend to carry out in action, and which I believe will be accomplished. For I hate him like death's gates who thinks one thing and says another. But I will speak what shall be accomplished. In these verses, he clearly indicates the character of the two men. He shows Achilles to be true and simple, and Odysseus to be cunning and deceitful, for he imagines Achilles addressing Odysseus in these lines.
Now Hippias, I think I understand your meaning. When you say that Odysseus is cunning, you clearly mean that he is deceitful?
Exactly, Socrates. It is the character of Odysseus, as he is portrayed by Homer in many passages of both the Iliad and Odyssey.
And we must presume that Homer intended to convey that the true man is not the same as the false?
Of course, Socrates.
And is that your own opinion, Hippias?
Certainly. How could I have any other?
Well, since there is no possibility of asking Homer what he meant in these verses of his, let us leave him, but since you are willing to defend his cause and your opinion aligns with what you claim to be his, will you answer on behalf of yourself and him?
I will. Ask me anything you like.
Do you say that the false, like the sick, have no ability to do things, or do they have the ability to do things?
I would say that they have the ability to do many things, and particularly to deceive mankind.
Then, according to you, they are both powerful and cunning, aren't they?
Yes.
And are they cunning and do they deceive because of their simplicity and foolishness, or because of their cunning and a certain kind of prudence?
Because of their cunning and prudence, most certainly.
Then they are prudent, I suppose?
Indeed they are, very much so.
And if they are prudent, do they know or do they not know what they do?
Of course, they know very well, and that is why they harm others.
And having this knowledge, are they ignorant or are they wise?
Wise, certainly, at least, insofar as they can deceive.
Stop and let us recall what you were saying. Are you not saying that the false are powerful and prudent and knowledgeable and wise in those things about which they are false?
To be sure.
And the true differ from the false. The true and the false are complete opposites, aren't they?
That is my view.
Then, according to your view, it would seem that the false are to be classified in the category of the powerful and wise?
Assuredly.
And when you say that the false are powerful and wise insofar as they are false, do you mean that they have or do not have the ability to utter their falsehoods if they want to?
I mean to say that they have the ability.
In short, then, the false are those who are wise and have the ability to speak falsely?
Yes.
Then a man who does not have the ability to speak falsely and is ignorant cannot be false?
You are right.
And every man has the ability who does what he wishes at the time when he wishes. I am not speaking of any special case in which he is prevented by disease or something of that sort, but I am speaking generally, as I might say of you, that you are able to write my name when you like. Would you not call a man able who could do that?
Yes.
And tell me, Hippias, are you not a skilled calculator and mathematician?
Yes, Socrates, certainly I am.
And if someone were to ask you what is the product of 3 multiplied by 700, you would tell him the true answer in a moment if you wanted to?
Certainly I would.
Is that because you are the wisest and most capable of men in these matters?
Yes.
And being as you are the wisest and most capable of men in these matters of calculation, are you not also the best?
Of course, Socrates, I am the best.
And therefore you would be the most capable of telling the truth about these matters, wouldn't you?
Yes, I would.
And could you speak falsehoods about them equally well? I must ask, Hippias, that you answer me with the same honesty and generosity that has characterized you so far. If someone were to ask you what is the product of 3 multiplied by 700, would you not be the best and most consistent teller of a falsehood, having always the ability to speak falsely as you have the ability to speak truly? About these same matters, if you wanted to tell a falsehood and not answer truthfully, would an ignorant man be better able to tell a falsehood in matters of calculation than you would be if you chose? Might he not sometimes stumble upon the truth when he wanted to lie, because he did not know, whereas you, who are the wise man, if you wanted to lie, would always and consistently lie?
Yes, you are absolutely right.
Does the dishonest person only lie about certain things, but not about numbers or calculations?
Indeed, he would lie about numbers just as much as other things.
So, can we assume that there are people who are dishonest about calculations and numbers?
Yes,
Who could those people be? You already admitted that someone who is dishonest must have the ability to be dishonest. You said that someone who is unable to be dishonest will not be dishonest.
yes, I remember saying that.
And weren't you just shown to be the best at being dishonest about calculations?
Yes, that was mentioned.
And are you also said to be truthful about calculations?
Certainly.
So, the same person is able to speak both falsely and truly about calculations. And that person is the one who is skilled in calculations, the mathematician?
Yes,
Therefore, Hippias, it is the good person who is discovered to be dishonest in calculations. Because the good person is capable and truthful.
that is clear.
Don't you see that the same person can be both dishonest and truthful about the same matters? And the truthful person is not any better than the dishonest person. In fact, they are the same, not opposites as you previously thought.
Not in that case, clearly.
Shall we examine other cases?
Certainly, if you're willing.
Aren't you also skilled in geometry?
I am.
Well, does the same principle apply in that field as well? Isn't the same person best able to speak falsely or truly about diagrams, and that person is the geometer?
Yes, it is the geometer and no one else.
So, the good and wise geometer has this double power to the highest degree. And if there is someone who is dishonest about diagrams, it would be the good person because they are capable of being dishonest. Whereas the bad person is incapable and therefore not dishonest, as we have admitted.
True.
Let's examine a third case then, the astronomer, in which you claim to be even more proficient than in the previous ones.
Yes, that's true, Socrates.
Does the same principle apply to astronomy as well? If someone is able to speak falsely, they would be the good astronomer. But if they are unable, they wouldn't speak falsely because they lack knowledge.
Clearly not.
So, in astronomy too, the same person would be both true and false?
It seems so.
Now, Hippias, consider this question in relation to all the sciences and see if the same principle always holds. I know that in most arts, you consider yourself the wisest of men, as I have heard you boast in the marketplace among the money changers when you were showcasing your great and enviable wisdom. You claimed that on one occasion, when you went to the Olympic Games, everything you had with you was made by yourself. You started with your ring, which you said you engraved yourself. You had another seal that you also made, as well as a strigil and an oil flask. You even made the shoes you were wearing, as well as the cloak and the tunic. But what impressed us the most was the girdle of your tunic, which you said was as fine as the most expensive Persian fabric, and you weaved it yourself. Moreover, you told us that you brought poems, epic, tragic, and dithyrambic, as well as prose writings of various kinds, all of which were your own creations. You also claimed to excel in the arts I mentioned earlier, as well as in rhythm, harmony, and orthography. If I recall correctly, there were many other accomplishments in which you excelled. I forgot to mention your art of memory, which you consider your special glory. I'm sure I've forgotten many other things, but as I was saying, consider your own arts, of which there are many, and those of others. Tell me, based on the admissions we have made, if you can find any field of art or any kind of wisdom or skill in which the true and false are different and not the same. Tell me if you can. But I don't think you can.
Not without careful consideration, Socrates.
Even with consideration, Hippias, I believe it won't help you. But if I am right, remember what the consequence will be.
I don't understand what you mean, Socrates.
I suppose you're not using your art of memory, probably because you don't think it's necessary in this situation. Let me remind you of what you were saying. Weren't you saying that Achilles was a truthful man, while Odysseus was false and cunning?
Yes, I was.
And now do you see that the same person has turned out to be both false and true? If Odysseus is false, he is also true. And if Achilles is true, he is also false. So, the two men are not opposed to each other, but rather alike.
Oh Socrates, you always engage in complex arguments, focusing on difficult points and details instead of addressing the main issue as a whole. Let me demonstrate, if you allow me, with many convincing proofs, that Homer portrays Achilles as a better and more truthful man than Odysseus. According to my argument, Achilles is honest while Odysseus is cunning and a teller of many lies, making him inferior to Achilles. After my demonstration, you can make a speech on the other side, arguing that Odysseus is the better man. Then we can compare our arguments and the company can decide who is the better speaker.
Oh Hippias, I have no doubt that you are wiser than I am. But when someone else speaks, I have a habit of paying close attention, especially if the speaker seems wise to me. I ask questions and analyze what they say in order to understand. However, if the speaker seems unskilled, I do not question them or bother myself with them. You can tell who I consider wise by observing that when I talk to a wise person, I am very attentive to what they say. I ask them questions to learn and improve myself. While you were speaking, I couldn't help but notice that you must be mistaken when you claim that Odysseus is a deceiver based on the verses where Achilles criticizes him. Odysseus, the cunning man, is never shown to be a liar in the story. However, Achilles, as you yourself pointed out, is deceitful. He speaks falsely when he says he is hateful to me even as the gates of death, who thinks one thing and says another. Later, he claims that he will not be persuaded by Odysseus and Agamemnon and that he will leave Troy after making sacrifices to the gods and loading his ships. He even describes his ship sailing over the Hellespont and reaching Phthia. But despite these claims, he never prepares or attempts to sail home. He shows no regard for the truth. Initially, I asked you the question because I was unsure which hero Homer intended to be the better man. I thought both were the best, and it would be difficult to decide who was superior not only in terms of truth and falsehood but also in virtue. Even in the matter of speaking the truth, they are quite equal.
You are mistaken, Socrates. When Achilles speaks falsely, it is unintentional. He is compelled to stay and save the army in their time of need. On the other hand, when Odysseus lies, it is deliberate and voluntary.
Hippias, you, like Odysseus, are a deceiver yourself.
No, Socrates, why would you say that?
Because you claim that Achilles does not lie intentionally, even though he is not only a deceiver but also a braggart. In Homer's description, Achilles is so cunning and superior to Odysseus in lying and pretending that he contradicts himself, and Odysseus doesn't notice. He doesn't say anything to imply that he perceives Achilles' falsehood.
What do you mean, Socrates?
Didn't you notice that later, when he speaks to Odysseus, he says he will sail away at dawn, but to Ajax he says something completely different?
Where does he say that?
He says, I will not think about bloody war until Hector, the son of Priam, comes and slaughters the Argives and burns their ships. I suspect that Hector, though eager for battle, will spare my tent and ship. Do you really think, Hippias, that the son of Thetis, who was taught by the wise centaur Chiron, had such a bad memory or would engage in such extreme lying after vehemently criticizing liars just moments before? By telling Odysseus he will sail away and Ajax that he will stay. Isn't it more likely that he was trying to deceive Odysseus, whom he saw as old and simple, using his own cunning and lies?
No, Socrates, I disagree with you. I believe Achilles says different things to Ajax and Odysseus out of innocence, while Odysseus, whether lying or telling the truth, always has a purpose behind his words.
So it seems that Odysseus might actually be better than Achilles, right?
Certainly not, Socrates.
Why not? Didn't we just establish that voluntary liars are better than involuntary ones?
Socrates, how can those who intentionally lie and commit wrongdoings be better than those who do so unknowingly? There is a strong excuse for someone who tells a lie or causes harm out of ignorance. The laws are much harsher on those who lie or do evil on purpose than on those who do so unintentionally.
Hippias, as I've mentioned before, I am persistent in questioning wise men. This is perhaps the only good thing about me, as I am flawed in many ways and often make mistakes. It is evident to me that when I meet someone like you, who is renowned for wisdom and respected by the Greeks, I am exposed as knowing nothing. I rarely share the same opinions as you, and what greater proof of ignorance is there than to differ from wise men? However, I have one redeeming quality: I am not ashamed to learn. I ask questions and seek answers, and I am grateful to those who respond to me. When I learn something, I never deny my teacher or claim it as my own discovery. Instead, I praise their wisdom and acknowledge what I have learned from them. Currently, I cannot agree with what you are saying. In fact, I strongly disagree. I know this is my own fault and a flaw in my character, but I won't pretend to be more than I am. My opinion, Hippias, is the complete opposite of yours. I believe that those who intentionally harm others, lie, deceive, and commit wrongdoings are far worse than those who do so unknowingly. However, at times I hold the opposite view. I am confused about this matter, which is clearly a result of my ignorance. Right now, due to our previous argument, I am inclined to believe that, in general, those who do wrong involuntarily are worse than those who do so voluntarily. Therefore, I hope you will be kind to me and not refuse to enlighten me. It would be a much greater favor to cure my soul of ignorance than to heal my body of illness. I must warn you, though, that if you give me a long speech, it won't cure me because I won't be able to follow you. But if you answer me as you just did, it will benefit me greatly, and I don't think it will harm you in any way. I also have a request for you, O son of Apemantus. You encouraged me to converse with Hippias, so now if Hippias refuses to answer me, you must plead on my behalf.
Socrates, I don't think Hippias will need my pleading. He has already said that he won't refuse to answer anyone. Isn't that right, Hippias?
Yes, I did say that, but then, Eutychus, Socrates is always troublesome in an argument and seems dishonest.
Excellent, Hippias. I don't do it intentionally. If I did, it would show me to be a wise man and a master of cunning, as you would argue. It's unintentional, so you must forgive me. As you said, someone who is unintentionally dishonest should be pardoned.
Yes, Hippias, do as he says. For our sake, and to uphold your reputation, answer whatever Socrates asks you.
I will answer as you request, and you may ask whatever you like.
I am very eager, Hippias, to explore this question of which is better, those who err voluntarily or those who err involuntarily. If you answer me, I believe I can guide you in approaching the subject. Would you agree that there are good runners?
Yes.
And there are bad runners?
Yes.
A good runner is someone who runs well, and a bad runner is someone who runs poorly, correct?
That's true.
So, in a race or when running, swiftness is a good quality and slowness is a bad quality.
Certainly.
Then who is the better runner? Someone who voluntarily runs slowly or someone who involuntarily runs slowly?
Someone who voluntarily runs slowly.
And running is a form of doing, right?
Certainly.
And if it's a form of doing, it's a form of action?
Yes.
So, someone who runs poorly is doing a bad and dishonorable action in a race?
Yes, it's a bad action for sure.
And someone who runs slowly runs poorly?
Yes.
Therefore, the good runner voluntarily performs this bad and disgraceful action, while the bad runner does so involuntarily?
That seems to be the case.
So, someone who involuntarily does evil actions is worse in a race than someone who does them voluntarily?
Yes, in a race.
Well, in a wrestling match, who is the better wrestler, the one who falls voluntarily or involuntarily?
The one who falls voluntarily, of course.
And is it worse or more dishonorable to fall or to throw another at a wrestling match?
It is worse to fall.
So, at a wrestling match, the one who voluntarily does base and dishonorable actions is a better wrestler than the one who does them involuntarily?
That seems to be the truth.
And what about other physical exercises? Isn't someone who is better able to do both strong and weak, fair and foul actions considered better? So, when they do bad actions with their body, the one who is better made does them voluntarily, while the one who is worse made does them involuntarily.
Yes, that appears to be true regarding strength.
And what about grace, Hippias? Isn't someone who is better made able to assume evil and disgraceful figures and postures voluntarily, just as someone who is worse made assumes them involuntarily?
True.
So, voluntary ungracefulness comes from excellence of the bodily frame, and involuntary ungracefulness comes from the defect of the bodily frame?
True.
And what would you say about an unmusical voice? Would you prefer a voice that is voluntarily or involuntarily out of tune?
I would prefer a voice that is voluntarily out of tune.
So, the involuntary one is worse of the two?
Yes.
And would you choose to possess goods or evils?
Goods.
And would you rather have feet that are voluntarily or involuntarily lame?
Feet that are voluntarily lame.
But isn't lameness a defect or deformity?
Yes.
And isn't blinking a defect in the eyes?
Yes.
And would you rather always have eyes with which you might voluntarily blink and not see, or with which you might involuntarily blink?
I would rather have eyes that voluntarily blink.
So, in your own case, you believe that voluntarily acting ill is better than involuntarily acting ill?
Yes, certainly, in cases like the ones you mentioned.
And does the same hold true for ears, nostrils, mouth, and all the senses? The ones that involuntarily act ill are not desired because they are defective, while the ones that voluntarily act ill are desired because they are good.
I agree.
And what about instruments? Which kind of instruments are better to have? The ones with which a person voluntarily or involuntarily acts ill. For example, would it be better for a person to have a rudder with which they will steer poorly voluntarily or involuntarily?
It would be better for them to have a rudder with which they will steer poorly voluntarily.
And does the same apply to the bow, the lyre, the flute, and all other things?
Very true.
And would you rather have a horse with a temper that you may ride poorly voluntarily or involuntarily?
I would rather have a horse that I could ride poorly voluntarily.
That would be the better horse?
Yes.
So, with a horse of better temper, vicious actions would be produced voluntarily, and with a horse of bad temper, involuntarily?
Certainly.
And the same would be true for a dog or any other animal.
Yes.
And is it better to possess the mind of an archer who voluntarily or involuntarily misses the mark?
It is better to possess the mind of the one who voluntarily misses.
This would be the better mind for the purposes of archery?
Yes.
So, the mind that involuntarily errs is worse than the mind that errs voluntarily?
Yes, certainly, in the use of the bow.
And what about the art of medicine? Doesn't the mind that voluntarily works harm to the body have more of the healing art?
Yes.
So, in the art of medicine, the voluntary is better than the involuntary?
Yes.
Well, in lute playing, flute playing, and all arts and sciences, isn't the mind that voluntarily does what is evil and dishonorable and goes wrong the better mind? And isn't the mind that does so involuntarily the worse mind?
That is evident.
And what about the characters of slaves? Shouldn't we prefer to have those who voluntarily do wrong and make mistakes? Aren't they better in their mistakes than those who commit them involuntarily?
Yes.
And shouldn't we desire to have our own minds in the best state possible?
Yes.
And will our minds be better if they do wrong and make mistakes voluntarily or involuntarily?
Oh, Socrates, it would be a monstrous thing to say that those who do wrong voluntarily are better than those who do wrong involuntarily.
And yet, that appears to be the only conclusion.
I do not think so.
But I thought, Hippias, that you did. Please answer once more, is not justice a power, or knowledge, or both? Must justice, at the very least, be one of these?
Yes.
But if justice is a power of the soul, then the soul with greater power is also the more just. Because, my good friend, we have proven that the one with greater power is better.
Yes, that has been proven.
And if justice is knowledge, then the wiser soul will be the more just, and the more ignorant soul will be the more unjust?
Yes.
But if justice is both power and knowledge, then won't the soul with both knowledge and power be the more just, and the more ignorant soul be the more unjust? It must be so, right?
Clearly.
And isn't the soul with greater power and wisdom also better, and better able to do both good and evil in every action?
Certainly.
So, the soul that acts badly does so willingly using its power and skill. And justice is comprised of one or both of these elements.
That seems to be true.
Doing injustice is doing wrong, while refraining from injustice is doing right.
Yes.
So, when a better and more capable soul does wrong, it does so willingly, while a bad soul does so involuntarily.
Clearly.
And a good man is one with a good soul, while a bad man is one with a bad soul.
Yes.
Therefore, if the good man is the one with a good soul, then he will willingly do wrong, while the bad man will do so involuntarily.
Indeed, he will.
So, Hippias, if there is a man who willingly does wrong and shameful things, he would be considered a good man?
I cannot agree with you on that.
Nor can I agree with myself, Hippias. Yet, based on our current argument, that seems to be the conclusion. As I mentioned earlier, I am confused and constantly changing my opinion. It is not surprising for me or any ordinary person to be confused, but if even you wise men are also confused and we cannot turn to you for guidance, then the situation becomes serious for both us and you.
Original Benjamin Jowett introduction has been moved to this epilogue. It seems impossible to separate by any exact line the genuine writings of Plato from the spurious. The only external evidence to them which is of much value is that of Aristotle, for the Alexandrian catalogues of a century later include manifest forgeries. Even the value of the Aristotelian authority is a good deal impaired by the uncertainty concerning the date and authorship of the writings which are ascribed to him, and several of the citations of Aristotle omit the name of Plato, and some of them omit the name of the dialogue from which they are taken. Prior, however, to the inquiry about the writings of a particular author, general considerations which equally affect all evidence to the genuineness of ancient writings are the following. Shorter works are more likely to have been forged or to have received an erroneous designation than longer ones, and some kinds of composition, such as epistles or panegyrical orations, are more liable to suspicion than others. Those, again, which have a taste of sophistry in them, or the ring of a later age, or the slighter character of a rhetorical exercise, or in which a motive or some affinity to spurious writings can be detected, or which seem to have originated in a name or statement really occurring in some classical author, are also of doubtful credit, while there is no instance of any ancient writing proved to be a forgery, which combines excellence with length. A really great and original writer would have no object in fathering his works on Plato, and to the forger or imitator, the literary hack of Alexandria and Athens, the gods did not grant originality or genius. Further, in attempting to balance the evidence for and against a Platonic dialogue, we must not forget that the form of the Platonic writing was common to several of his contemporaries, Aeschines, Euclid, Phaedo, Antisthenes, and in the next generation Aristotle, are all said to have composed dialogues, and mistakes of names are very likely to have occurred. Greek literature in the 3rd century before Christ was almost as voluminous as our own, and without the safeguards of regular publication or printing or binding, or even of distinct titles. An unknown writing was naturally attributed to a known writer whose works bore the same character, and the name once appended easily obtained authority. A tendency may also be observed to blend the works and opinions of the master with those of his scholars. To a later Platonist, the difference between Plato and his imitators was not so perceptible as to ourselves. The memorabilia of Xenophon and the dialogues of Plato are but a part of a considerable Socratic literature, which has passed away, and we must consider how we should regard the question of the genuineness of a particular writing if this lost literature had been preserved to us. These considerations lead us to adopt the following criteria of genuineness. 1. That is most certainly Plato's which Aristotle attributes to him by name, which 2. Is of considerable length, of 3. Great excellence, and also 4. In harmony with the general spirit of the Platonic writings. But the testimony of Aristotle cannot always be distinguished from that of a later age, see above, and has various degrees of importance. Those writings which he cites without mentioning Plato, under their own names, e.g. the Hippias, the funeral oration, the Phaedo, etc., have an inferior degree of evidence in their favor. They may have been supposed by him to be the writings of another, although in the case of really great works, e.g. the Phaedo, this is not credible. Those again which are quoted but not named are still more defective in their external credentials. There may be also a possibility that Aristotle was mistaken or may have confused the master and his scholars in the case of a short writing, but this is inconceivable about a more important work, e.g. the Laws, especially when we remember that he was living at Athens and a frequenter of the groves of the Academy during the last 20 years of Plato's life. Nor must we forget that in all his numerous citations from the Platonic writings he never attributes any passage found in the extant dialogues to anyone but Plato. And, lastly, we may remark that 1 or 2 great writings, such as the Parmenides and the Politicus, which are wholly devoid of Aristotelian 1. Credentials may be fairly attributed to Plato on the ground of 2. Length, 3. Excellence, and 4. Accordance with the general spirit of his writings. Indeed, the greater part of the evidence for the genuineness of ancient Greek authors may be summed up under 2 heads only. 1. Excellence, and 2. Uniformity of tradition. A kind of evidence, which though in many cases sufficient, is of inferior value. Proceeding upon these principles, we appear to arrive at the conclusion that 19/20ths of all the writings which have ever been ascribed to Plato are undoubtedly genuine. There is another portion of them, including the epistles, the epinomies, the dialogues rejected by the ancients themselves, namely, the Axiochus, de Justo, de Virtute, Demodocus, Sisyphus, Eryxias, which on grounds, both of internal and external evidence, we are able with equal certainty to reject. But there still remains a small portion of which we are unable to affirm either that they are genuine or spurious. They may have been written in youth, or possibly like the works of some painters, may be partly or wholly the compositions of pupils, or they may have been the writings of some contemporary transferred by accident to the more celebrated name of Plato, or of some Platonist in the next generation who aspired to imitate his master. Not that on grounds either of language or philosophy, we should lightly reject them. Some difference of style, or inferiority of execution, or inconsistency of thought, can hardly be considered decisive of their spurious character. For who always does justice to himself, or who writes with equal care at all times? Certainly not Plato, who exhibits the greatest differences in dramatic power, in the formation of sentences, and in the use of words, if his earlier writings are compared with his later ones, say the Protagoras or Phaedrus with the Laws, or who can be expected to think in the same manner during a period of authorship extending over above 50 years in an age of great intellectual activity as well as of political and literary transition? Certainly not Plato, whose earlier writings are separated from his later ones by as wide an interval of philosophical speculation as that which separates his later writings from Aristotle. The dialogues which have been translated in the first appendix and which appear to have the next claim to genuineness among the Platonic writings are the Lesser Hippias, the Menexenus or Funeral Oration, the First Alcibiades. Of these, the Lesser Hippias in the Funeral Oration are cited by Aristotle, the first in the Metaphysics, the latter in the Rhetoric. Neither of them are expressly attributed to Plato, but in his citation of both of them he seems to be referring to passages in the extant dialogues. From the mention of Hippias in the singular by Aristotle, we may perhaps infer that he was unacquainted with a second dialogue bearing the same name. Moreover, the mere existence of a greater and lesser Hippias, and of a first and second Alcibiades, does, to a certain extent, throw a doubt upon both of them. Though a very clever and ingenious work, the Lesser Hippias does not appear to contain anything beyond the power of an imitator, who was also a careful student of the earlier Platonic writings, to invent the motive or leading thought of the dialogue may be detected in Zen. Mem, and there is no similar instance of a motive which is taken from Xenophon in an undoubted dialogue of Plato. On the other hand, the upholders of the genuineness of the dialogue will find in the Hippias a true Socratic spirit. They will compare the ion as being akin both in subject and treatment. They will urge the authority of Aristotle, and they will detect in the treatment of the sophist, in the satirical reasoning upon Homer, in the reductio ad absurdum of the doctrine that vice is ignorance, traces of a Platonic authorship. In reference to the last point, we are doubtful, as in some of the other dialogues, whether the author is asserting or overthrowing the paradox of Socrates, or merely following the argument, whither the wind blows. That no conclusion is arrived at is also in accordance with the character of the earlier dialogues. The resemblances or imitations of the Gorgias, Protagoras, and Euthydemus, which have been observed in the Hippias, cannot with certainty be adduced on either side of the argument. On the whole, more may be said in favor of the genuineness of the Hippias than against it. The Menexenus or Funeral Oration is cited by Aristotle and is interesting as supplying an example of the manner in which the orators praised the Athenians among the Athenians, falsifying persons and dates and casting a veil over the gloomier events of Athenian history. It exhibits an acquaintance with the funeral oration of Thucydides, and was, perhaps, intended to rival that great work. If genuine, the proper place of the Menexenus would be at the end of the Phaedrus. The satirical opening and the concluding words bear a great resemblance to the earlier dialogues. The oration itself is professedly a mimetic work, like the speeches in the Phaedrus, and cannot therefore be tested by a comparison of the other writings of Plato. The funeral oration of Pericles is expressly mentioned in the Phaedrus, and this may have suggested the subject in the same manner that the Cleitophon appears to be suggested by the slight mention of Cleitophon and his attachment to Thrasymachus in the Republic, in the Viacs by the mention of Viacs in the Apology and Republic, or as the second Alcibiades seems to be founded upon the text of Xenophon, Mem. A similar taste for parody appears not only in the Phaedrus, but in the Protagoras, in the Symposium, and to a certain extent in the Parmenides. To these two doubtful writings of Plato I have added the first, Alcibiades, which, of all the disputed dialogues of Plato, has the greatest merit and is somewhat longer than any of them, though not verified by the testimony of Aristotle, and in many respects at variance with the Symposium in the description of the relations of Socrates and Alcibiades. Like the lesser Hippias and the Menexenus, it is to be compared to the earlier writings of Plato. The motive of the piece may, perhaps, be found in that passage of the Symposium in which Alcibiades describes himself as self-convicted by the words of Socrates. For the disparaging manner in which Schleiermacher has spoken of this dialogue, there seems to be no sufficient foundation. At the same time, the lesson imparted is simple, and the irony more transparent than in the undoubted dialogues of Plato. We know, too, that Alcibiades was a favorite thesis, and that at least 5 or 6 dialogues bearing this name passed current in antiquity and are attributed to contemporaries of Socrates and Plato. 1. In the entire absence of real external evidence. 4. The catalogues of the Alexandrian librarians cannot be regarded as trustworthy, and 2. In the absence of the highest marks either of poetical or philosophical excellence, and 3. Considering that we have expressed testimony to the existence of contemporary writings bearing the name of Alcibiades, we are compelled to suspend our judgment on the genuineness of the extant dialogue. Neither at this point, nor at any other, do we propose to draw an absolute line of demarcation between genuine and spurious writings of Plato. They fade off imperceptibly from one class to another. There may have been degrees of genuineness in the dialogues themselves, as there are certainly degrees of evidence by which they are supported. The traditions of the oral discourses both of Socrates and Plato may have formed the basis of semi-Platonic writings. Some of them may be of the same mixed character which is apparent in Aristotle and Hippocrates, although the form of them is different. But the writings of Plato, unlike the writings of Aristotle, seem never to have been confused with the writings of his disciples. This was probably due to their definite form and to their inimitable excellence. The 3 dialogues which we have offered in the appendix to the criticism of the reader may be partly spurious and partly genuine. They may be altogether spurious. That is an alternative which must be frankly admitted. Nor can we maintain of some other dialogues, such as the Parmenides and the Sophist and Politicus, that no considerable objection can be urged against them, though greatly overbalanced by the weight, chiefly, of internal evidence in their favor. Nor, on the other hand, can we exclude a bare possibility that some dialogues which are usually rejected, such as the greater Hippias and the Cleitophon, may be genuine. The nature and object of these semi-Platonic writings require more careful study and more comparison of them with one another, and with forged writings in general, than they have yet received, before we can finally decide on their character. We do not consider them all as genuine until they can be proved to be spurious, as is often maintained, and still more often implied in this and similar discussions, but should say of some of them that their genuineness is neither proven nor disproven until further evidence about them can be adduced. And we are as confident that the epistles are spurious as that the Republic, the Timaeus, and the Laws are genuine. On the whole, not a 20th part of the writings which pass under the name of Plato, if we exclude the works rejected by the ancients themselves and 2 or 3 other plausible inventions, can be fairly doubted by those who are willing to allow that a considerable change and growth may have taken place in his philosophy. See above. That 20th debatable portion scarcely in any degree affects our judgment of Plato, either as a thinker or a writer, and those suggesting some interesting questions to the scholar and critic is of little importance to the general reader.